It was a total and complete mess in the establishment survey, the payroll numbers. Meanwhile, the household survey is sending very strong recession signals. Four of them, in fact. Three of those four, very solid, clear, and unambiguous about recession. And the fourth one merely backs up the other three. More and more evidence keeps coming in that shows that this is indeed a business cycle. The downside of the business cycle that is more and more, as more months go by, becoming more familiar as a recession. Let's start with the establishment survey because that was just a complete mess, and that's the number that most people focus on. Now remember how we got here. The establishment survey last year, the BLS would issue a good number and then revise it lower the next month or the 2 months later as they go through the revision process. Well, we are back to that. Last month, the BLS did benchmark changes to the payroll reports, which we talked about, which ended up creating these huge positives in December and January. Well, now that the BLS is back to its monthly downward revisions, December and January look very different, even before we get to February. December went from 216,000 to 333,000. That was the benchmark change. It moved December, which was stronger than expected at 216, all the way up to 333. And then remember, the initial January report was 353, which blew away every estimate, not only because nobody was thinking that was possible, but because everything else in the labor market screams the opposite of a huge payroll number. So we had two 300s in a row that nobody was expecting. Again, at the same time, everything else was basically falling apart. But as of today, in the latest update, that December 333 has been dropped to 290. So there's 43,000 jobs gained that were never really gained. Meanwhile, January, that was 353. Incredible blowout payroll number. That's been dropped to 229. Huge decline. You put those two together, you have a cumulative downward revision of 167,000 in 2 months. So we went from two better than 300, really two better than 330,000 to now just 290 and 229. But everyone says, look at February. February comes in at 275, which is much better than expected. So even if we have downward revisions in December and January, we've got a good one in February. And the response to that is, do we have a good one in February? Is it going to last March and into April? My point is, as the establishment survey continues to be more and more volatile in its initial estimates and then revisions, it has become less and less reliable. And the establishment survey is supposed to be the gold standard that we all follow, which is why this is one of the few macroeconomic statistics that the general public will follow. But if the general public is following a series that the government that keeps it isn't really all that sure about it, what is that actually telling us about the actual situation? What is the information that we're getting from it? It's not as reliable as it's supposed to be, and it's becoming more noisy, less reliable all the time. So the establishment survey, that looks fine, but does it really look fine? That's the question we have to ask because we don't know for sure. We don't know how it's going to come out next month or the month after. And one of the things that really pointed to the establishment survey being way out of whack last month with a huge January number, that was, of course, hours. Hours went the opposite direction. We had a really big down month in hours, even though this is, again, the establishment survey drawn from the same survey results, even though it was the same exact data, at least supposed to be. Hours went down big, and of course, with a huge increase in payrolls, that meant the average work week plummeted down to 34.1 hours. And I think that was one reason why we see such a big downward revision in payrolls, because it was such an obvious aberration that they pointed the finger at a statistical issue. So the BLS took a second look at January and said, yeah, there's no way there was that many payrolls because the work week is just way out of whack. So the average work week was revised up, but only to 34.2. Not a huge upward revision to the average work week because their hours worked are still incredibly weak, as we'll see from the household survey side. There is a comprehensive picture outside the noisiness in the establishment survey that suggests this is indeed a business cycle, and one that has turned, very likely has turned decisively in the direction of recession. Even if the payroll, the main payroll number doesn't show a minus sign or even looks to be strong on its initial estimate, there's more and more evidence that looks in the opposite direction. So let's talk about the household survey. As I mentioned in the introduction here, there were 3 very, very strong, very, very unambiguous and clear recession signals, solid recession signals in the household survey. And then there was a 4th that backs up what the other 3 are implying. We'll start with the household survey number itself, the level of employment. Now remember, the household survey is the opposite side, or supposed to be the opposite side of the establishment survey. The establishment survey is where the BLS surveys establishments, employers, and says, how many people do you have on your payrolls? How many you're employing? Whereas the household survey asks employees, those in a household, how many people do you have working in your household? So basically, looking at the same idea, but coming at it from different directions. And the household survey has diverged from the establishment survey pretty substantially for quite a little period of time here. This is not something new, but the household survey has its own way of looking at the employment situation too. And over the last several months, it has become uglier and uglier and uglier, including February, the latest number. According to the BLS, the household survey number of employment fell again by 184,000. Now, it had been down 31,000 in January, but that included a negative population control factor. But even so, it had a huge decline in December of nearly 700,000. So the household survey has really started to turn ugly here on a very consistent basis. And that's what we're really looking for out of the household survey, because it can be up and down, back and forth, not to this extreme, but high degree of variation on a month-to-month basis. So you have more and more negatives that begin to pile up, maybe with an occasional positive in between. It starts to send a more solid signal over a period of more than a couple months. And in fact, the 6-month average in the household survey is now minus 89,000. It's a negative on the 6-month average, which is our first recession signal. Now, I'm going to go back to the late 1960s here because that's plenty. We're talking about 8 recession periods up until now. That gives us a very good sense of the history of these statistics. And going back to the late 1960s, what we see is that on a 6-month average basis, only 14 times do we see the household survey level of employment negative. 8 of those were just outright recessions, as you can see. They match up with recession periods pretty well because, as you would expect, if households on average are saying over a 6-month period, we have fewer of us working, that sounds a lot like recession. We've talked about the hiring freeze. This is the other part of it that we've been missing thus far. So while 8 were outright recessions, 8 of the 14, 2 others were periods leading up to recessions. That was the summer and fall of 2000 when the job market started to get weak, even before we got to the dot-com recession, the bond market inversions, all that stuff. So that was the period leading into the dot-com recession. And of course, the summer of 2007, which was a period leading into the Great Recession, Great quote-unquote recession. So even though those 2 periods don't fall inside the official recession dates, they were quite clearly the labor market weakening on its way to recession. 2 other of our exceptions were just after recessions, meaning weak recoveries, and happen to be the same 2 cycles. We have the end of 2002, where the household survey turned negative, the jobless recovery that plagued the Bush administration. Not that Bush had anything to do with the economy, but that's how it goes in politics. But the weak recovery following the dot-com recession, that shows up in the household survey employment number. And, of course, the very weak recovery, the not recovery, after the great not recession. So that leaves us with just 2 genuine exceptions in the household survey being negative on a 6-month basis. One was October 2013. That was just the government shutdown. It had nothing to do with the economy, so we can forget that one. And the only other time in more than 50 years of history in the household survey where you have a negative 6-month change, the 6-month average, that doesn't correspond with a recession, middle of 1995. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the video and why that's so important. So let's move on to the second big household survey recession signal. And that is full-time jobs, something we've been talking about because of the massive decline in December. Remember December, full-time jobs collapsed by 1.5 million. But because full-time jobs continue to decline, what that tells us is maybe 1.5 million wasn't the actual number, but as we don't see any kind of recovery or snapback in the statistics, that means that there was a substantial decline, and it is continuing to decline. It was not a 1 month or temporary aberration. There was something really going on in full-time employment, not just in December. We continue to see the negatives pile up here. For the month of February, we had another 187,000 decline in full-time jobs. That would have been substantial even if there hadn't been a 1.5 million decline in December. So we're seeing full-time jobs. Businesses are indeed taking measures to cut their costs because they must also be seeing weakness in the general economy. They're responding to something that doesn't look like a soft landing. And really going back to last June, we see full-time jobs down by 1.8 million. So that gives us a 6-month average of minus 220,000, and that's our second recession signal. We look at the 6-month average in full-time employment for the household survey. Most of them absolutely do line up with the official declared recessions, as we would expect. There are a couple small exceptions, very small exceptions. You got a minus 3,000 6-month average in July of 1999. So that's just in the aftermath of the Asian not financial crisis. You got a small negative in June of 2004, which is basically a fluctuation because by then you do have an actual recovery underway after the dot-coms. You got a small negative again, July 2007, leading up to the Great Recession. And of course, last year, actually not last year, the year before last year, it's now 2024. So late in 2022, we had a negative in full-time jobs as it looked like the economy was heading toward recession in early 2023, only to be saved at the last minute by a couple things: the disinflation rebound and the January 2023 cost of living adjustments, which drastically increased income. But really, the only exception where you get this deeply negative on a 6-month average basis for full-time employment is 1994. Not even 1995, but 1994. And that was a statistical discontinuity. That's not a real number. That's just a problem in the statistics where in January 1994, the BLS updated its series and didn't go back and revise its prior numbers, which they don't do in a household survey. So outside of 1994, which is discontinuity, you get full-time employment falling this much on a 6-month average basis. So for this prolonged period, that's a solid recession signal. Signal number 3, the unemployment rate. Now, although the unemployment rate came in at 3.9% in the month of February because household survey measure of employment declined, and although the labor force ticked up, that just meant that those who entered the labor force actually became officially unemployed. They didn't find a job because jobs are shrinking according to the household survey. So the unemployment rate moved up to 3.9%, which is the highest thus far. And though that sounds like not much of a big deal, 3.9% is incredibly low. It's not far off of what was a 50-year low. However, it's not the level, it's the amount the unemployment rate has changed in a relatively long period of time. We're going back 10 months now, and the unemployment rate is actually up 0.5 point, which is our recession signal. We see very few times outside of recession when the rate has gone up over a 10-month span. There's a couple times when the unemployment rate moves up by a few tenths in the middle 1980s. There was late 1995. That one comes back there. 1998, 1999, the Asian not financial crisis, that just moved up by 1/10 of a point. Both before and after 1989, 1990, that was, looking like the unemployment rate was breaking out in late 1989 and into early 1990 before we got to the real S&L recession later on in 1990. And of course, there was a first jobless recovery in the aftermath of 1990-91. That shows up there. Plus 2003, same thing, jobless recovery. So the only time we see a 0.5 point increase over a 10-month period in the unemployment rate, though, that is clearly a recession signal. So the other exceptions never got to 0.5 point. 0.5 point is where we get to that threshold where Unless this time actually is different and in a number that everybody actually does watch, everybody pays attention to the unemployment rate, this is one that is solidly recession. Our fourth signal is actually part-time jobs. Now, this one is less consistent, but something that we do see in many recession periods. Part-time jobs actually increase by a lot. And the reason they're increasing by a lot is because many workers are being cut back in their hours, which means they no longer qualify as being full-time. So fewer full-time jobs and more part-time jobs. So workers are being converted as businesses. Instead of just laying off workers, they also cut their costs by working them less. This is a theme that we've been coming back to over and over again over the last 7, 8 months and 10 months now. Full-time jobs, as I mentioned, those are down about 1.8 million since June. Part-time jobs are up about 1.7 million, which kind of works out, again, suggesting that a lot of workers have seen their hours cut, which goes along with the hiring freeze that we keep talking about too. And we saw the same thing happen in the 2007, 2008, 2009 cycle. From March to September 2008, you saw a modest increase in part-time work, then the big jump later on in the recession. Again, the summer of 2000 and then the summer of 2001, that's a little bit of an increase in part-time jobs. But another big increase, 1981, 82. You get a modest increase in 81 and then a bigger jump later on in the recession process, which raises a bunch of questions because we've seen part-time jobs and full-time jobs. Part-time jobs really increase and full-time jobs really decrease, which is normally a later recession or later stage recession type of process. So that's another one that backs up the three other very solid, very clear recession signals. And because of that, because the labor market is actually relatively weak and getting weaker, substantially weaker, the Fed and its rate cuts. Now, I want to come back to 1994-95, and Josh, you always listen to Josh. Josh says we should do a whole video on 94-95, the bond massacre, the Greenspan rate hikes. But what Greenspan's really known for is after hiking rates from January 1994 to February 1995, from 3% to 6%, that's the federal funds target, we got some weakness in the real economy. As I mentioned, the household survey turned negative on a 6-month basis. There was a little bit of an issue with full-time jobs. Greenspan then cut rates first of all in July of 1995, and then two more times in December 95 and January 96. And of course, there was no recession. He has been given credit by some economists with engineering a soft landing. I don't think the weakness was all that much. Obviously, we didn't see the same recession signals in a broad survey of data like we have seen today. But that's the legend of Greenspan, one of the myths that cemented the reputation of the Fed during the Great Moderation, as it came to be known later. And that's what Jay Powell is going to do, and that's the idea he's going to give you moving forward. As the economy continues to weaken, and it looks more and more like a recession, like we all picture a recession, Powell's going to point to 1995 and say, after the huge rate hikes, Greenspan engineered a soft landing with a couple nice, gentle rate cuts. That's what we've got planned for you in 2024 and maybe part of 2025. No big deal. Don't worry about these negative numbers. Just know that we have you covered. I'm going to pull another Greenspan in 1995. That's the narrative that we're going to get moving forward as the economy moves into recession. The establishment survey, complete mess. It's unreliable. It's becoming more unreliable, not less, especially the revisions, which are just making a joke out of what's supposed to be the gold standard. The household survey, 3 really solid recession signals here, including the unemployment rate. It's not the level, it's the rate of change. And it's how sustained all of these changes are over more than a month or two. So we've got 3 solid recession signals, plus the part-time jobs, which backs up what we're seeing in full-time employment. More and more it looks like a recession. More and more evidence is coming down that businesses are indeed responding to not a soft landing. I did a full video just recently on how American workers can feel this recession coming. And now that we have even more data backing them up, it's worth revisiting. That's the one linked below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you to Eurodollar University members and subscribers. Until next time, take care.